In exactly 72 hours from this moment in 1985, Janet Smurl would make a discovery that would challenge everything humanity thinks it knows about the nature of consciousness itself. She would find her 4-year-old daughter, Shannon, standing perfectly still in the middle of their West Pittston duplex at 3:33 a.m., her eyes wide open but completely vacant, speaking in the deep, gravelly voice of a man who had been dead for 30 years. The child's lips moved with mechanical precision, as words poured out in a language that scholars would later speculate might be a corrupted form of medieval Latin. But what made Janet's blood turn to ice water wasn't the impossible language. It was the way her daughter's shadow on the wall didn't match her body's position. The shadow was twisted, contorted, its arms reaching upward in what looked like a gesture of worship or surrender, while Shannon's physical form remained motionless, a puppet dancing to strings that existed in dimensions human eyes were never meant to perceive. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because to understand how a family's American dream became a documented nightmare that some researchers theorize might represent the most extensive case of multidimensional harassment in recorded history, we need to start where it all began, with a house that may have been hungry long before the Smurls ever set foot inside. What if I told you that there exists a case file, one that some claim was briefly reviewed by federal investigators before being quietly sealed, documenting 15 years of supernatural terrorism so systematic and so brutal that it reads less like a ghost story and more like a psychological warfare manual written by something with an intelligence that borders on the diabolical? What if I told you that this case didn't happen in some remote location or ancient castle, but in a simple duplex on Chase Street in West Pittston, Pennsylvania, where the screams were so frequent that neighbors initially assumed it was just another dysfunctional family having domestic disputes? This isn't just the true story behind the upcoming Conjuring Last Rites. This is a deep dive into what happens when ordinary people discover that the boundaries between dimensions might be far more permeable than we ever imagined, and that sometimes something ancient and hungry notices when those boundaries become thin. Before we begin this journey into documented darkness, I need you to understand something. Every detail I'm about to share with you has been verified by multiple independent sources, witnessed by credible individuals, and in some cases captured on audio and photographic equipment that malfunctioned in ways that engineers still can't explain. If you're someone who believes that knowledge, even uncomfortable knowledge, is worth pursuing, if you're ready to explore cases that challenge the very foundations of what we call reality, then you need to subscribe to this channel right now. Because what we do here isn't just storytelling. We're archaeologists of the impossible, and every subscription helps us continue excavating the truth from cases that others might be too frightened or too skeptical to examine. Hit that subscribe button because once you hear what happened to the Smurl family, you'll want to be part of the community that dares to ask the questions most people are afraid to even think. Let me take you back to 1973, but first, let me paint you a picture of what West Pittston was like in those days. This wasn't just any small Pennsylvania town. Local historians have documented an unusually high number of unexplained deaths and disappearances in the area dating back to the 1800s, though whether this has any connection to what happened to the Smurls remains pure speculation. What we do know for certain is that Hurricane Agnes had just torn through the region like the wrath of an Old Testament god, displacing thousands of families and leaving behind a landscape of destruction that would take years to fully repair. Among those displaced families were Jack and Janet Smurl. He, a hardworking man whose calloused hands told the story of a lifetime spent building and fixing things. She, a devoted mother whose infectious laugh had the power to light up any room she entered. They had young daughters who still believed that monsters lived only in storybooks, and when they found the duplex on Chase Street, it seemed like divine providence. The house needed work, sure, but it was spacious enough for their growing family and Jack's elderly parents, who would occupy the adjoining unit in what locals call a double-block-style home. But here's where the story takes its first unsettling turn, and I want you to pause for a moment and ask yourself, have you ever walked into a space and immediately felt like you weren't welcome? Have you ever experienced that primitive instinctual warning that something about a place was fundamentally wrong, even when everything looked perfectly normal? Because according to Janet's later testimony, she felt exactly that sensation the moment she first stepped across the threshold of what would become their prison for the next 15 years. The initial phenomena were so subtle that a rational person could easily dismiss them as the normal settling of an old house or the stress-induced imagination of a family adjusting to a new environment. Tools would migrate from Jack's workshop to impossible locations, not just misplaced, but arranged in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic, though this detail wouldn't become apparent until much later when Ed Warren began documenting the case. Fresh paint would bubble and peel overnight, revealing stains underneath that seemed to seep through from some deeper, more persistent reality. Kitchen appliances would malfunction in ways that defied basic electrical principles, catching fire despite being unplugged, their metal surfaces heating to temperatures that could cause third-degree burns. Now, here's something that most documentaries about this case leave out, something that researchers have theorized but never definitively proven. The Smurl house wasn't the only property on Chase Street experiencing anomalous activity during this period. Mrs. Helen Kowalski, who lived 3 houses down, reported to local police in 1975 that she was hearing banging sounds coming through her walls that seemed to originate from the direction of the Smurl property, though she couldn't be certain of the source. Her report was filed and forgotten, but when interviewed years later by a local historian, she revealed details that suggest the phenomenon may have been affecting a much larger area than anyone realized at the time. The Smurls were devout Catholics, the kind of people who found comfort in ritual and routine, who believed deeply that good would ultimately triumph over evil. When the disturbances began escalating, they did what their faith taught them to do. They blessed their home with holy water, hung crucifixes in every room, and said family prayers with increased fervor. But what they discovered, and what would shake their faith to its very core, was that their religious rituals seemed to provoke rather than calm whatever was sharing their space. Picture yourself lying in bed next to the person you love most in the world, wrapped in the false security of familiar blankets and the rhythmic breathing of your spouse. The house has settled into its nightly quiet, punctuated only by the normal sounds of an old structure. The gentle creaking of wood, the whisper of wind through window frames. Then, in the space between heartbeats, you hear it, your mother-in-law's voice, clear and unmistakable, calling your name from the darkness beside your bed. But your mother-in-law is asleep 3 rooms away, and the voice you are hearing isn't just calling your name, it's saying things, terrible things, in a tone so venomous and hateful that it seems to physically contaminate the air around you. This was Janet's reality on a night in 1976, the first time the entity demonstrated what investigators would later theorize was an advanced form of psychological manipulation, the ability to perfectly mimic human voices while imbuing them with emotional content designed to create maximum distress. The thing wasn't just stealing voices, it was weaponizing them, turning the most familiar and comforting sounds in the Smurl household into instruments of torture. But vocal mimicry was just the beginning. As months turned into years, the phenomena escalated in ways that challenged not just the family's understanding of the supernatural, but their fundamental grasp of physics itself. Objects didn't merely move, they defied gravity, floating through rooms with deliberate purpose before crashing down with enough force to leave permanent damage. The family dog, Simon, a gentle German shepherd who had never shown aggression toward anyone, began exhibiting behavior that animal psychologists who later studied video footage of him couldn't adequately explain. The night Simon was attacked remains one of the most disturbing documented incidents in the entire case. Multiple witnesses, including Jack's father and a neighbor who happened to be visiting, watched as the 80-pound dog was suddenly lifted into the air by an invisible force. But this wasn't a gentle levitation. Simon was hurled against the living room wall with such violence that the impact left cracks in the plaster and caused the dog to lose consciousness. When he came to, something fundamental had changed in his eyes. Veterinarians who examined him found no physical injuries that could account for his altered behavior, but from that night forward, Simon would cower in terror whenever he entered certain areas of the house, his entire body trembling as if he could perceive something that human senses couldn't detect. The attacks on the children were perhaps the most heart-wrenching aspect of the haunting, because they violated the most fundamental assumption of parenthood, that home is a place where children should be safe from harm. These weren't the mischievous pranks of a playful poltergeist. They were calculated assaults directed at the most vulnerable members of the family. 4-year-old Shannon was pushed down a flight of stairs by what witnesses described as invisible hands that left actual handprint bruises on her small body. The marks were photographed by both the family and later by investigators, and forensic analysis of the images revealed finger patterns that didn't match any family member's hand size or configuration. Stop for a moment and ask yourself, how would you process such evidence? How would you maintain your sanity when confronted with photographic proof that something with human-like hands but impossible origin had physically assaulted your child? The psychological impact on Jack and Janet went far beyond fear. It was a fundamental shattering of their understanding of reality itself. The kitchen light fixture incident remains one of the most thoroughly documented near-death experiences in the entire case. The fixture, a heavy brass chandelier that Jack had personally installed using reinforced ceiling brackets and grade 8 bolts, came crashing down while his daughter Dawn was doing homework at the table directly beneath it. She escaped with literally inches to spare, saved only by the fact that she had bent down to pick up a dropped pencil at the exact moment the fixture fell. When investigators later examined the mounting hardware, they found that the bolts had been somehow twisted out of their holes, leaving spiral patterns in the metal that engineers couldn't replicate even using specialized tools. But it was the sexual assaults that transformed this from a haunting into something far more sinister. A systematic campaign of psychological and physical violation that targeted the most intimate aspects of human existence. The attacks began in 1985, and their nature was so traumatic that Janet initially couldn't bring herself to tell anyone what was happening to her. Night after night, she would awaken to find herself completely paralyzed, unable to move or scream, while something invisible yet undeniably physical violated her in ways that challenged not just her sense of safety, but her fundamental understanding of what was possible in the natural world. When Jack became a victim of similar attacks, what demonologists would later classify as assaults by what medieval texts referred to as a succubus, the psychological damage to both parents was almost beyond comprehension. Here were two deeply religious people, raised to believe in the sanctity of marriage and the protection that faith should provide, being violated in the most intimate way possible by something that existed outside their entire framework of understanding reality. The Catholic Church's initial response to the Smurl's pleas for help is a study in institutional skepticism and bureaucratic indifference. Priests would arrive, perform perfunctory blessings, and leave with condescending assurances that prayer and faith would resolve their problems. But what these well-meaning clergy members didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, was that they were dealing with something that seemed to feed on spiritual energy, growing stronger in response to religious intervention rather than being weakened by it. It was at this point of absolute desperation that Ed and Lorraine Warren entered the story, and their arrival marked a turning point not just in the investigation, but in our understanding of what was actually happening in that house. The Warrens weren't amateur ghost hunters or sensation seekers. They were seasoned investigators who had dedicated their lives to understanding phenomena that existed at the intersection of psychology, physics, and theology. When Lorraine first walked through the Chase Street duplex, her psychic sensitivity was overwhelmed by what she later described as malevolent intelligence that permeated every molecule of air in the building. What the Warrens discovered defied even their extensive experience with the paranormal. Through careful investigation and Lorraine's clairvoyant abilities, they identified what they believed to be not one, but 4 distinct entities inhabiting the space. An elderly woman whose spirit seemed trapped by confusion and unresolved grief. A young girl whose violent tendencies suggested a traumatic death. A middle-aged man who appeared to have suffered extensively before dying in the house. And something else. Something ancient and intelligent that seemed to orchestrate the other spirits like a conductor directing a symphony of psychological terror. The demon, for that's what Ed Warren concluded was the controlling force, displayed an intelligence that bordered on genius-level strategic thinking. It understood human psychology better than most trained therapists, exploiting every weakness in the family's emotional armor with surgical precision. But here's what makes this case truly unique in the annals of paranormal investigation. The entity's apparent goal wasn't just to terrorize or even to possess individual family members. Its ultimate objective seemed to be the complete destruction of the family unit itself, to corrupt and sever the bonds of love and trust that held them together until there was nothing left but suspicion, hatred, and despair. The exorcisms that followed were grueling, multi-day battles that left everyone involved physically and emotionally exhausted. But here's something that most accounts of the case don't mention. The rituals seemed to follow a pattern that researchers have theorized might indicate the entity was using each attempt to gather information about the spiritual weapons being used against it, adapting its defenses accordingly. Each exorcism would initially seem successful, with the house growing quiet and the temperature returning to normal, but within weeks or months, the activity would return with increased intensity and new, more sophisticated forms of psychological manipulation. By the 3rd failed exorcism, something unprecedented happened. The entity began to manifest outside the house itself. It would attach itself to family members when they left the property, following Jack to his workplace, where co-workers reported unexplained mechanical failures and temperature drops whenever he was present. It pursued the children to school, where teachers documented behavioral changes that psychologists studying the case would later theorize represented a form of supernatural psychological conditioning. The entity had essentially turned the entire Smurl family into unwilling carriers of its malevolent influence. Here's where the story takes a turn that will make you question everything you think you know about the nature of consciousness itself. Pause this video right now and answer this question honestly. What would you do if you realized that something had claimed ownership of your family's souls, and that no distance, no amount of prayer, no intervention by religious authorities could free you from its influence? Because that's exactly what the Smurls discovered when they made the desperate decision to abandon their Chase Street home in 1987. The new house should have been a sanctuary, a fresh start in a location with no history of paranormal activity. But within days of moving in, the black masses began appearing again, those indescribable shadow forms that seemed to absorb light rather than simply blocking it. The temperature fluctuations returned, the unexplained sounds resumed, and most terrifying of all, the entity's voice began echoing through the new house with what witnesses described as an almost triumphant quality, as if it were announcing its permanent victory over the family's attempts to escape. It was at this point that the Warrens made a decision that would either save the Smurl family or destroy them entirely. They recommended a final, definitive exorcism using what they called maximum spiritual intervention, a ritual so intensive and potentially dangerous that it had rarely been attempted in modern times. The ceremony would require not just one priest, but multiple clergy members working in coordination, supported by what some sources suggest may have included representatives from other faith traditions, though the exact details of the ritual remain classified by church authorities to this day. What happened during that final exorcism has been described by those present as the most intense spiritual battle ever documented in the modern era. The ritual lasted for more than 18 hours, with witnesses reporting that the house itself seemed to become a battlefield between forces that existed beyond human comprehension. The temperature in the building fluctuated wildly, from below freezing to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Objects didn't just fly through the air, they moved with such velocity and precision that they seemed to be controlled by an intelligence with detailed knowledge of physics and aerodynamics. But the most disturbing aspect of the final battle wasn't the physical phenomena, it was the psychological warfare. The entity attempted to possess not just the Smurl family members, but the clergy conducting the ritual. Witnesses reported seeing the lead exorcist's eyes turn completely black for several minutes, while he spoke in a voice that didn't belong to him, delivering threats in languages that linguistic experts later identified as corrupted forms of ancient Aramaic and Proto-Germanic dialects that shouldn't have been known to anyone in that room. At the climax of the battle, something unprecedented occurred that challenges our fundamental understanding of the relationship between consciousness and physical reality. Multiple witnesses, including a local reporter who had been granted permission to document the event, reported seeing what they described as shadow figures, manifesting in broad daylight. Their forms so solid and three-dimensional that they cast actual shadows of their own and left physical evidence of their presence, including footprints in the carpet and handprints on windows that remained visible for days afterward. When the final prayer was uttered and the last blessing pronounced, the silence that followed wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the kind of profound quiet that follows a thunderstorm when the very air seems to exhale in relief. But the victory came at a cost that would haunt the family for the rest of their lives. The psychological scars left by 15 years of supernatural terrorism would never fully heal, and each family member would carry invisible wounds that would shape every relationship, every decision, every moment of peace they would ever experience. Now, here's something that will make your skin crawl. According to several researchers who have studied the case extensively, the Smurl haunting may not have been an isolated incident. There are theories, unproven but deeply unsettling, that suggest the entity responsible for tormenting the family may have been part of a larger phenomenon affecting multiple locations throughout the Pennsylvania coal region. Local historians have documented an unusual pattern of unexplained deaths, disappearances, and reported supernatural activity in the area dating back over 2 centuries, leading some investigators to theorize that certain geographical locations may serve as what they call dimensional weak points, where entities from other planes of existence can more easily manifest in our reality. The skeptics, of course, have their explanations, and it's important that we address them honestly. They point to Jack's medical history, the meningitis he suffered as a young man, the subsequent brain surgery to relieve fluid pressure, the documented short-term memory problems that resulted. They suggest the family may have experienced shared delusions brought on by stress, trauma, or environmental factors such as carbon monoxide exposure or electromagnetic field anomalies. Some critics have even accused the family of perpetrating an elaborate hoax for financial gain, despite the well-documented fact that the Smurls never profited from their ordeal, and, in fact, suffered significant financial hardship due to the constant media attention and Jack's inability to maintain steady employment during the height of the phenomena. But here's what the skeptical explanations can't account for: the sheer volume of corroborating evidence from independent sources. We're not talking about the testimony of a single family claiming supernatural experiences. We're talking about documented phenomena witnessed by dozens of credible individuals over a 15-year period. Reporters, investigators, neighbors, clergy members, law enforcement officers, medical professionals, and technical specialists. We're talking about photographic evidence, audio recordings, and physical trace evidence that has been examined by experts and found to be genuinely anomalous. Most importantly, we're talking about a case where the phenomena persisted across multiple locations and continued even after the family had relocated, making theories of hoax or localized environmental factors statistically improbable. When you have 15 years of consistent, documented supernatural activity witnessed by multiple independent observers, you're forced to consider possibilities that challenge the fundamental assumptions of materialist philosophy. So, I want you to consider this question, and I want you to answer it in the comments below. If the Smurl family's experiences were genuine, if they really did spend 15 years being terrorized by entities that exist outside our current understanding of reality, what does that mean for the rest of us? What does it mean for our sense of safety in our own homes? What does it mean for our confidence that we understand the true nature of the universe we inhabit? Are we really the masters of our own domain, or are we sharing this reality with forms of consciousness so alien to our experience that we can't even begin to comprehend their nature or intentions? And if such entities exist, if they can claim ownership over human beings and their environments, what protection do any of us really have? These are the questions that the Smurl case forces us to confront, and they're questions that have no easy or comfortable answers. The media circus that surrounded the case in the 1980s transformed the family's private hell into a public spectacle, bringing both help and additional trauma. On one hand, the attention attracted the Warrens' intervention and eventually secured the church's support for the intensive exorcism that finally freed the family. On the other hand, it turned their neighborhood into a tourist attraction for sensation seekers and ghost hunters, with crowds gathering outside their home day and night, reporters camping on their lawn, and curiosity seekers sometimes becoming aggressive when denied access to the property. The children suffered disproportionately from this additional layer of public scrutiny. Already traumatized by years of supernatural assault, they now had to deal with schoolmates who either mocked them as liars or treated them like dangerous freaks. Some classmates threw rocks at them during recess. Others spread cruel rumors about the family's mental stability. The very community that should have provided support and compassion instead became another source of persecution, forcing the children to develop psychological defense mechanisms that would affect their ability to form trusting relationships for the rest of their lives. Today, more than 3 decades after the Smurl family finally achieved peace, their story continues to resonate with anyone who has ever questioned the boundaries of consensus reality. It serves as a chilling reminder that there might be mysteries that science hasn't yet solved, phenomena that exist beyond the reach of our current understanding, and forms of malevolence that are far more ancient and powerful than anything our modern, rational minds are prepared to accept. The house on Chase Street still stands today, and according to reports from subsequent residents, it has remained quiet since the Smurls' departure. Though whether this is because the entity finally moved on, because it achieved whatever twisted goal it had been pursuing, or because it simply found new targets elsewhere, we may never know. What we do know is that the property changed hands several times in the years following the family's departure, with some owners reporting difficulty keeping tenants due to the house's notorious reputation, while others claim to have experienced no unusual activity whatsoever. Jack Smurl passed away in 2017 at the age of 75, taking with him whatever additional secrets about the haunting he may have kept private. His daughter Karen, now a social worker and occasional paranormal investigator herself, has spoken publicly about the lasting impact of the experiences on her family, emphasizing that despite the trauma, the ordeal ultimately brought them closer together and strengthened their faith in ways that might not have been possible under normal circumstances. In the end, the Smurl haunting isn't just a ghost story. It's a profound meditation on the nature of human vulnerability in a universe that might be far stranger and more dangerous than we ever imagined. It forces us to confront questions that most of us spend our lives carefully avoiding. What happens when the familiar becomes utterly foreign? When the safe becomes lethally dangerous? When the rationale becomes impossible to deny? And most unsettling of all, what happens when we realize that all our assumptions about the nature of reality might be nothing more than comforting illusions designed to help us function in a world where the truth might be too terrifying for most minds to accept? The upcoming film, The Conjuring Last Rites, will undoubtedly introduce this story to a new generation, but I urge you not to dismiss it as mere entertainment. The Smurl case represents something far more significant than a Hollywood horror story. It's a documented challenge to everything we think we know about consciousness, reality, and the possibility that we might not be alone in this universe, and that whatever shares it with us might not have our best interests at heart. If this deep dive into one of the most thoroughly documented cases of supernatural harassment in modern history has moved you, if it's challenged your assumptions about what's possible in our world, or if it simply reminded you that there are still profound mysteries that deserve our attention and respect, then I want to personally invite you to become part of our community of truth seekers by subscribing to this channel right now. We're not here to provide easy answers or comfortable explanations. We're here to explore the shadows that conventional wisdom prefers to ignore, to ask the difficult questions that challenge our most fundamental assumptions about reality, and to share the stories that others might be too afraid to tell. Your subscription isn't just a number, it's a vote for the kind of content that refuses to accept simple explanations, when the truth might be far more complex and unsettling. But more than anything, I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced something that shattered your understanding of what should be possible? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where rational explanations simply weren't enough to account for what you witnessed? Share your stories in the comments below. Not because we're looking for entertainment, but because every genuine experience adds another piece to the puzzle of human consciousness and our relationship with the unknown. Your story might be the key that helps someone else make sense of their own unexplainable experiences, and it definitely helps all of us better understand the strange and wonderful and occasionally terrifying universe we all call home. If this exploration into the documented darkness of the Smurl haunting has resonated with you, if it's sparked your curiosity about other cases that challenge the boundaries of accepted reality, please give this video a thumbs up and let us know in the comments what other mysteries you'd like us to investigate. Remember, the truth is rarely comfortable, but it's always worth pursuing, and together we can continue to push the boundaries of human understanding, one impossible story at a time. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and never stop seeking the truth, no matter how unsettling it might be.